What? Superman can go all black, and so can I. Zack Snyder's Justice League. It's out. I've seen it. All 4 hours plus of it. Here's the thing that's really difficult for me. Here's where I'm actually having a really hard time formulating my thoughts. I'm not entirely sure how to frame a conversation around this thing. Because what this movie, I'm just going to call it a movie for lack of anything else to call it, what it is a very unique thing. And I don't mean the subject matter or the end result. I mean why it exists and why it exists in the form that it does. Because let's be very clear about one thing. This is not the movie that we would have gotten released to theaters had Zack Snyder not left after the preliminary round of shooting for Justice League and had Joss Whedon not taken over. If those events hadn't happened and he had been allowed to finish that movie and release it to theaters, what we get right now on HBO Max is not what that movie would have been. It's not, because the amount of freedom that he was granted on this, which Warner Brothers kind of had to give him because the entire pitch was this was his unfiltered, untouched vision for what the film was. This was never going to be released to theaters, ever. Not at this length and not at this expense. And I will remind you that despite being initially budgeted at an additional $35 million on top of what they already spent on Justice League the first time around, this ended up doubling that and costing them about another $70 million. So between the cost and the fact that a 4-hour movie is going to have fewer turnovers in a day, which means fewer people are going to get to see it again, which is going to hit your box office and hit your bottom line, this was never going to be released to theaters. So what we don't have is a glimpse into what the movie would have been. And in addition to that, before anyone counters, well, originally Justice League was going to be 2 movies, and this is that. This absolutely isn't that either, because there's no point at, lengthwise, 4 hours. It's long enough that you could say, well, it's two 2-hour movies crammed together. Structurally, though, it's not. There's nothing even approaching a feasible stopping point anywhere close to the half point of this. There actually really isn't a decent stopping point till about 3 hours in, and then you've got a second movie that's only an hour long and nothing but action. So, no, that doesn't fly either. So, what we have is a 4-hour, 7-chapter, probably the closest thing I could think to call it is a mashed together miniseries, because the 7 chapters run about half an hour, 35 minutes, some of them 40-ish minutes, and they just run back to back to back, except it's not really that either, because each chapter is not self-contained enough that it would actually function as an episode, which is probably why, despite the rumors early on that HBO Max was going to release this as a mini-series, they ultimately released it as one chunk, because these chunks wouldn't be satisfying on their own. It really does have to be watched as a continuous thing. But all right, I've kind of been dancing around the issue and avoiding talking about how is it? Okay. Is this better than the Justice League that was released to theaters? Oh yeah, unquestionably. It was always going to be. No matter what your opinion of Zack Snyder's take on these heroes is, this was always going to be a better film because it was made under better circumstances, because the cut that was released theatrically was a hodgepodge of a mostly shot film taken over by a completely different director who went through extensive reshoots but couldn't shoot the whole thing from the ground up and still had to repurpose a lot of stuff that was in somebody else's vision, just by the Frankensteinian nature of that theatrical cut's production. This was always going to be better just for the sake of coherency and for appearing like a properly fleshed out and thought out single product, as opposed to a mad scramble to mash up something because we have to get something into theaters. Otherwise, our shareholders are going to hang us out to dry. So yes, unquestionably, this is better than the theatrical Justice League. And in case anyone doesn't know my opinion on that, which at this point, a lot of people probably don't, While I'm not really one to defend it as a film, I did kind of enjoy the theatrical release of Justice League, although admittedly a lot of that probably had to do with lowered expectations in the first place. But I came out and was like, I had fun. So that's kind of where I was at that one. I never bothered to rewatch it. I suppose that's another thing. I neither rewatched the theatrical cut of Justice League for comparison purposes, nor did I rewatch Batman v Superman knowing that this was going to directly pick up from that. And actually, it's funny. My first note, because I actually do take notes sometimes, my first note that I took was, oh crap, should I have rewatched Batman v Superman again? Thankfully, I really didn't have to. I mean, you kind of need to have seen it at least once, because this is building off enough of it that if you don't know what happened in Batman v Superman, you are going to be lost at the starting status quo of this film. But it's building off the broad strokes, and it does not call back to enough of the specifics, at least that I caught, that it becomes a necessity that you need to have refreshed yourself on the previous film, which is good, because Batman v Superman is still a bad movie, and this movie being, all right, here it goes, actually pretty good, does not retroactively make Batman v Superman a good movie. That is still a bad movie. But this thing, looking at it on its own, I thought I was going to be in for basically a 4-hour hangover. This was a pretty good movie. This is, I would actually argue, probably the best film that Zack Snyder has made. I say this as someone who has a very mixed feelings about most of his filmography, but I don't dislike all of his stuff. I liked Dawn of the Dead. I love 300. I don't like Watchmen. Did a whole video on my problems with that. And Sucker Punch was, Man of Steel, I saw what he was going for. It didn't work for me. Batman v Superman was a disaster. This is a really solid piece of work. And probably owing to the fact that he was given as much true control this time. And I underline that word true control because people probably can try and argue that he had pretty strong control over Batman v Superman, and he did, except he also didn't, because he still had to work within the confines of what was expected of a major blockbuster in terms of setting up the other things. Because, look, I don't doubt that Snyder was the one who decided what they were going to be and how they were going to be integrated into the film, but I have a very hard time believing that were he not making it with the insistence of the people funding the thing, that he set up a whole bunch of other movies, that things like the little mini trailers for Flash, Aquaman, and Cyborg would be in there, or that the dream sequence, well, maybe the dream sequence, but like there's a bunch of stuff in that movie that I have a hard time buying he would have put in unless he was either told or strongly believed, because it would have been the reasonable assumption that they needed to be for this to set up a whole bunch of franchise stuff. In terms of actually telling a story, a bunch of that stuff didn't need to be there. Is this thing totally devoid of setup stuff? No, although it is pretty much largely relegated to an epilogue, and the epilogue's about the one part of this thing that I actually don't particularly care for, but not because it's setting up a whole bunch of other stuff for other reasons. I'll come back to it. But setting the epilogue aside for a moment, this really does work, and I think it works, and what it made me realize is what Snyder does, or what his instincts as a director kind of drive him to do. If you're going to have him do any story more complicated than there's a battle between the Spartans and the Persians, and that's kind of the whole movie, then you need to give him enough time where what he does, which is a lot of slow build, a lot of slow motion, and a lot of, frankly, on-the-nose needle drops, for that stuff to work, it needs breathing room. Because if it doesn't have the kind of breathing room that a 4-hour runtime gives it, then that means that it is eating up time that would be better spent actually moving things forward and refining and tightening the story. Because I found myself watching this, and there's a bunch of stuff in here that I'm not going to say for whatever this thing is, that it was a bad idea to include. But I can tell you absolutely would have been trimmed to heck had this been the theatrical release. Good example for that is the extended action scene where Steppenwolf, quick note on his design, I still don't love the look, but I will say that the design that he has in this absolutely justifies him being a 100% CGI creation, whereas the look in the theatrical, honestly, there was no reason for him to be 100% CGI for that look. They could have done that practically. So it is kind of a case of, if you're going to go full CGI, at least have the design be something that you couldn't do practically, which this is. So, points for that. But when Steppenwolf attacks Paradise Island and the Amazons to take control of the mother box, it's the first one he gets his hands on. The action scene involved in this it comes in waves, because first of all, you have the parademons arriving, you have Steppenwolf arriving, you have an extended action scene inside this sort of stone temple thing, which is not short, but that ends with Hippolyta grabbing the mother box, getting out. They collapse the tunnels to the temple thing, and they drop the temple into the ocean, hoping that stops Steppenwolf. He gets out, and then you have basically an action chase scene where they're trying to run the mother box away from him, and he is fighting Amazon. It's Amazon's trying to slow him down. So if this were a theatrical release, that entire second part of the chase is the kind of thing that you would cut. Not because it wasn't good, it was, but when you are trying to confine to a reasonable runtime for a theatrical release, which usually tops out about 2.5 hours, 3 at a stretch, if you can really sort of justify that it's definitely going to put all the butts in seats. I mean, let's not forget, the only reason Endgame got away with a runtime as long as it had is because it was the culmination of 10 years of one of the most successful ongoing franchises in film history. Otherwise, they wouldn't have tried it and they wouldn't have gotten away with it. But if you're not allowing that kind of runtime, the entire second half of this, the chase aspect of it, you would have cut, because ultimately it's so early in the film and he's got 3 of these things to collect. There's no doubt he is going to get a hold of it. So stretching that out further doesn't really benefit anything when you're trying to be more economical with your runtime. When you throw the rules of economical use of time completely out the window, which this does, then honestly, it doesn't feel like the same kind of waste of time that it would have, that would have resulted in that second half of this action scene being cut in a theatrical release, or at least trimmed down substantially. So another example is with Batman looking for Barry Allen. There are a number of setups for that. There is some scenes that Bruce has with Alfred ahead of time, and this whole thing that wasn't in the theatrical with Barry applying for jobs. And there's this action scene where we see his powers on display, where he saves a character who is presumably Iris West, seems to be implicated at least, and the nature of that, while it demonstrates his powers, so do later scenes anyways, and the sort of reminding us that he's looking for him, here's where he is in the search of him, here's Barry, and sort of all those pieces are what you would drop, so that you could basically do a quick reminder that Batman's looking for him, and then jump to Batman showing up where Barry lives, and then having the scene as it plays out from there. So again, it's those kinds of things are the sorts of things that would have been cut from a standard theatrical film. But having them here and allowing the whole thing to just take more time actually allows for the kinds of indulgences that Snyder likes to do play properly, because it's not feeling like it's wasting time that could be better spent somewhere else. He's got 4 hours to play with. Why not use it to do this? Now, that's not me saying the man should just be allowed to make 4-hour movies. Like, that's not going to happen. Not with things of this kind of budget. Like I said at the start, this was never going to be released to theaters as we see it. But for what it is, it's pretty good. Now, like I said, I didn't refresh myself on the theatrical version of Justice League, so I could not go through point for point and really break down everything that is different about it. That having been said, a lot of the additions are between the action scenes. The things that are largely the same, although in some cases extended, like I mentioned with the Amazons versus Steppenwolf, the action scenes are actually the closest to being unchanged from the theatrical release, which makes a lot of sense because the easiest stuff to adjust in reshoots would have been the connective tissue between those action scenes, as opposed to starting from scratch on the action scenes themselves, because those take so much work in terms of preparation, pre-visualization, and how long the effects work takes on them. The idea of reshooting those was probably never in the cards. So pretty much all the action scenes that you saw in the theatrical version are here in some form. Again, generally a little bit extended, but there aren't really any new action scenes that were created out of whole cloth. They're all in both versions to some degree. Most of what was added here was just the stuff in between. And there is a difference in tone, obviously. This is darker and more serious. Barry Allen actually does a pretty good job at lightening the mood, at least at times, so that not everybody is a broody misery guts. Because, yeah, most of them are. If the character who's probably done the best in terms of improvement from the previous version, in addition to Steppenwolf, but that's largely cosmetic. Although that cosmetic difference does actually help a fair amount. But beyond that, it's Cyborg. It's Victor Stone. And given what Ray Fisher has said about his experience working with Joss Whedon on Justice League, it's actually kind of rewarding to see the character get done justice here. Oh, God, I didn't mean to use that choice of words. Anyways, much more so than he was in the theatrical release, because we get time spent on his origin, what happened to him prior to him becoming Cyborg, his relationship with his father, and just getting a sense of who he is and where he's at. We understand him as a character a hell of a lot better here than we ever had a shot at doing in the theatrical version. So if you felt Cyborg was short-shrifted before, he gets a pretty good run in this one. There really aren't too many other major changes, at least as far as the characterization goes, for anybody else. Because, like I said, it's a little bit jokier in tone in the theatrical version, but all the roles that people are playing, their function in the story and the script, it's exactly the same as before. This is actually way less changed from the theatrical version than I expected. I expected a lot more very substantive changes, especially given how many headlines there were about all of the cut characters from before who were now going to be in this. But the thing is, nearly all of those are cameos, and most of them don't amount to all that much. The one who probably gets the most additional stuff is, well, I was going to say Darkseid, but it's not even really Darkseid. It's Desaad, who is Darkseid's right hand, but sure, Darkseid by extension. But he doesn't really become a presence. He's just a looming threat, something that will probably have to be dealt with later. Within the actual story being told, no, he doesn't really do all that much. And then there are additions like the Martian Manhunter, whose initial appearance is weird. I don't really know why. But the thing is, like, I'm tilting my head at things like that. But again, when something is this long and allowed this much breathing room, a moment like that doesn't seem as egregious because, again, you're not really wasting time. You've got the time to spare. Now, let's talk about Superman specifically. I was expecting the most drastic shift in terms of him, and there both is and there isn't. The way things actually play out with him are actually not that far off at all from how they were in the theatrical version. I mean, the main difference is the black suit. But in addition to that, there's less active work being done in this to really try and establish the kind of light that Superman was supposed to be and never was. So what's sort of odd is this film still behaves as if Superman is or was this wonderful, hopeful sign of light and peace and hope in the world, even though that wasn't really in evidence in either of the previous two movies, but this still kind of behaves like it does, which means one of two things, and I can't say which it is. Either Snyder kind of realized he had failed to properly make Superman a symbol of hope and altruism, and just kind of pretended that he had and then moved forward as if that had always been the case. Or he genuinely thought that he had and didn't recognize that, no, you really didn't paint him that way. But that's only an issue taking on the baggage of the previous films, which, this doesn't exist in a vacuum, but as a solo viewing experience, Superman's actually handled pretty well. It is odd to me that he's at his most heroic in the black suit, and then in the epilogue, we have him in his colors again, and he's evil. Epilogue, push back the epilogue. I will get back to that. If it seems like I'm actually being a bit more critical of this, despite the fact that me saying it's actually quite good, that comes down to one major thing. While I think this is the best thing that Snyder has done, and is definitely the best version of this kind of take on these heroes that I think we could probably ever hope to get, I still don't really like this take on heroes, but that comes down to a matter of taste. My disliking the darker and more broody version of the heroes, like across the board, like for some of them I get it. Batman, that's like his whole bag at this point. But having it be the tone of the entire movie is just not for me, broadly speaking, when it comes to superhero stories. But if you are going to do that, this is a very good version of that. Excellent, even. It just comes down to a debate over whether or not you feel this is the version of these heroes that should be getting put forth in the first place. I feel like in many ways, the disconnect for me and for how I wish to see heroes depicted and how Snyder chooses to depict heroes is probably best exemplified by not Cyborg as a character, but by this voiceover we get from Victor Stone, Cyborg's father, sort of laying out all the capabilities of what Cyborg can do. And he goes through, you can connect to any network, you can hack anything, you can do all this stuff. And there's a lot of emphasis on all the bad things he could do, on how he could hack any system, spy on anybody, set off nukes if he wanted. And that the true mark of heroism is going to be resisting the temptation to do that. And while there's some nicer things in that voiceover a little bit later, the fact that it leads with that and spends way more time on all of the horrible things Cyborg could do if he wasn't a better person, I think speaks a lot to the difference in how Snyder and I view heroes, or the lens through which they view heroes. Because strictly speaking, saying that part of what makes a hero heroic is resisting the temptation to use their abilities to do bad things is not untrue. But I, for one, put a lot more weight in the things that they choose to do as opposed to the temptations that they resist. I tend to think that what makes someone heroic and admirable is if their thought process is, what's the most good I can do with this, as opposed to what's the least bad. And again, the component parts of a superhero in terms of, resisting temptation to use it for selfish purposes and all the rest of that, that's present in every superhero. So it's not like Snyder is pulling this out of thin air. It exists in any superhero, but to come at it from that angle, as opposed to, it's basically like opposite sides of the John F. Kennedy quote, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. His position basically being, ask not what superheroes can do for you, but what you should be grateful for superheroes. It's a very Randian perspective. And normally I don't dig into the personal beliefs and political machinations inside the heads of filmmakers, except that Snyder's fairly outspoken with his more Randian philosophy, and the fact that he's been trying to get Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead made for some time speaks to that as well. And this is a very Randian take on superheroes, basically implying because they could destroy you, you should be happy that they don't, as opposed to what is usually, say, the Marvel perspective, certainly in the films, you should admire these people because they help. His perspective seems to at least lean more towards the angle of you should just be grateful that they don't wreck you, because they could. So suck it up. And it's not a perspective I share. But again, my philosophical disagreements with the perspective aside, that doesn't make this a bad movie. Which is largely the same angle that I come at 300 from. I have a lot of philosophical disagreement with a lot of the implications or flat out stated beliefs and intentions behind those characters and the movie as a whole. But I still think it's a really good movie. That's kind of where I'm at with this. The fundamental philosophical approach to these characters is not one that I would ever say should be the approach to superheroes. But it's the one he chose, and he executed it well. So for me, there's really no debate over whether Snyder accomplished what he set out to do and accomplished it well. The only point of contention is whether or not something he should have been doing in the first place. And sometimes that can be a little bit more clear-cut. In this case, I'm prepared to say that's largely going to be a matter of taste. So if this approach that he takes to it really, it rubs me the wrong way somewhat, but if it really rubs you the wrong way to the point that you're kind of appalled that I even say it's a good movie, I get it. If you love this so much that you're kind of annoyed with me that I say that I'm disagreeing with the philosophy of it, no, I get it. But that's just kind of where I'm at with this thing. Up until the epilogue. The epilogue really feels like the one bit that I'm like, what? Why? Why is that there? I suppose in theory, it's there to try and pay off the nightmare stuff from Batman v Superman, except it really doesn't. It's just more setup for what would have theoretically been the follow-up to this. And what I don't like about it is that, especially given how tonally dark and how broody a lot of the characters are, I was surprised at how uplifting the film felt by the time Steppenwolf was defeated. It was uplifting and affirming and hopeful in a way that Batman v Superman never even came close to being. So the fact that it managed to do that with this overall dark, desaturated tone, I was actually really impressed by. But that sense of hope and triumph is absolutely 100% undercut by the epilogue. Which, I guessed, spoilers? Because since structurally it's almost the exact same film as the theatrically released Justice League, just tonally different and more, it's actually almost impossible to spoil, except when it comes to the epilogue. The epilogue is about the one thing that is almost entirely new and is actually spoilable. So if you haven't seen it yet, I would imagine you would have. But anyways, that's your one spoiler warning you're going to get at this point. So the epilogue is another supposedly, hypothetically, premonition nightmare that Bruce Wayne has about the future. A future where Aquaman's dead, Wonder Woman is dead, and he has to team up with the likes of Mera, Deathstroke, and the Joker to try and fight back against a Superman who is now evil. And also it's implied that somewhere along the way Lois Lane died, and that's what sent Superman over the edge, or at least might have. Which seems to imply to me that we're dealing with some sort of extrapolated or twisted or Snyderized version of the Injustice timeline. In my opinion of Injustice is very much, thank God it's an alternate timeline and was never made part of the official canon, because as an Elseworlds, cool. As your primary canon, no. But the whole thing, especially given that, at least so far as official, there's no word of any kind of sequel for this. And even if this does really well on streaming, I really don't see a sequel happening. Only because for as much additional money as they had to spend on this, that was still a drop in the bucket compared to what they had actually already spent on the dang thing. To allow Snyder to do a follow-up from scratch where most of the movie wasn't already filmed as existing footage and they only had to do pickup shots and a few reshoots and then some CGI work. I don't see how this could ever do enough numbers to justify a starting from zero follow-up. I don't. That said, I didn't think we were ever going to get this, so I may get proved wrong on that, but I'd be shocked. That's all I'm saying. So it's odd to me that, and supposedly it's because this is how Snyder always envisioned the movie ending, so he wanted things to wrap up in this way and set up future stuff. And I okay, but it really does undercut the sense of an ending and of hope that this movie had left me with. And it kind of says to me that Snyder doesn't believe in hope and doesn't want to leave you with a sense of hope. He wants to leave you with a sense of dread, which again becomes a very fundamental philosophical difference between what I want out of superhero stories and what attracts him to superhero stories. His perspective seems to be always looking towards the next threat. What's the next thing that's going to make the world terrible, as opposed to we made the world better for now. And the epilogue really kind of does speak to that. And that's where some of the additional cameos come in. That's where Deathstroke shows up. Although he shows up before that as well. Because apparently the whole jailbreak with Lex Luthor and then Deathstroke showing up, I guess that was part of his original plan. I'd assume that was a Whedon insert. Not so much. Interesting. But that's where we get the Joker. I will say this. Jared Leto's Joker works a heck of a lot better here than he did in Suicide Squad. I really could have done without the one gay-coded line that actually really felt horrendously crowbarred in and did not feel like a natural extension of the conversation that was going on. That actually really annoyed me. But remove that line and his performance is actually decent. And his banter back and forth with Ben Affleck is pretty good. So maybe he could even have been a decent Joker, given a better film than Suicide Squad to be it in. I don't know. I'm not prepared to go that far, but I'm at least prepared to entertain the notion. Because what we get here I can work with. What was in Suicide Squad was ugh. But I think that's about it. Again, I feel like I don't know what to call this. I'm calling it a movie for lack of a better term. But it's not a movie by most standard measures. But it's not a miniseries. It's not a duology. It's just the Snyder Cut. It is just its own thing. And what it is pretty good at being what it sets out to be. Much better than Batman v Superman. Because Batman v Superman is a case of where I would argue not only is what it was trying to be probably not worth being, or at least I don't feel it was something that you should be doing, I also think it flat out failed at being it. This isn't that. This absolutely succeeds. And for me, the debate is whether it was a good idea in the first place. But again, I feel like that's more a matter of taste here than is usually the case. That's Zack Snyder's Justice League. Did you see it? What did you think about it? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Like, share, subscribe, the usual stuff. I have a Patreon if you are willing to help me out there. This is, in fact, my living. It is how I pay my bills. And there are perks at every tier. There's also YouTube memberships now if you would prefer to support me that way. But no pressure. The usual stuff, like, share, subscribe, they help me out as well. But you don't have to do that either, because at the end of the day, you're the council. I'm just running the meetings. And until next time, this council's adjourned. I actually thought it was good. Did not call that.